So in chapter 166 of One Punch Man, we finally got to see Blast fight, and it didn't disappoint. But it also revealed, at least to me, what level of power he's on, and I think that level is God. Now, of course, heroes don't get disaster levels, unless they go renegade or something, but we the fandom usually just give heroes or non-monsters or antagonists disaster levels just as a fun way to label what level of power they could be at. And on this channel, we've speculated for years about what Blast disaster level could be. I mean, at the minimum, we were putting him at like Ryuijo, aka Above Dragon, but we also thought that there was like a real possibility that this guy was disaster level God in power. And I think it's finally confirmed that he's pretty much there, mainly because of his performance against Cosmic Fear Garo in chapter 166. Character who I, at least personally, designate as disaster level God as well. I made a video about this last week, you can check it out right here, and we kind of knew that there was a good chance that Blast was going to be this strong, especially since the first time that we fully saw him when he appeared in front of Saitama, Flashy Flash, and Monaco underneath the Monster Association. I mean, right off the bat, he was already like manipulating space, and his abilities appeared like event horizons. But it's the moment when Flashy Flash decided to test him when we really knew that, okay, Blast is probably as strong as we thought he was, because Flashy Flash, in his own words, went top speed and attacked him with the flashy kicks. Not only did this do nothing to Blast, but he instantly appeared behind Flashy Flash, pretty much told him to calm down. Flashy Flash like immediately started sweating in a panic. And this is what I like to refer to as being defeated via fear. And this is Flashy Flash, let us not forget. He's no chump. He's actually one of the strongest characters in the series. He was able to participate in that three-way fight against Platinum S and Pre-Awakened Garo. The two latter are pretty much considered to be above dragons, right? Now, Flashy Flash was kind of like the weak link among them, but still, he was competitive at moments and was able to keep up with their incredible speed. But as we saw against Blast, it was a much different story. So that right there was kind of showing us that Blast was like even above what a Ryuijo and or Above Dragon was. Also, guys, if you like my One Punch Man content, please subscribe if you haven't already. It's fine if you don't want to, but if you just needed a reminder, here you go. And that brings me to his fight against Cosmic Fear Garo in chapter 166. So the first attack he launches at Garo is the Dimension Cannon. And as Garo evades this, he calls it a force transfer. So that's like a weird way of describing that, right? And to be honest, I'll probably have to talk to Nitro or Gray Words about the translation on that. But force is the strength or energy of an attribute of a physical action or movement. So is this like a Togashi-like way of trying to describe an energy projectile or something? But regardless, it goes back to Blast's implied space manipulation abilities, or maybe more so gravity manipulation, because after Garo dodges this, Blast is able to open a portal that sends Garo in front of him, and he winds up hitting him in the face with an attack called Gravity Knuckle. Now, it has the same aesthetic as the Dimension Cannon, but it's on his fist, and I think the word gravity here might be giving us insight into what Blast's overall power is. And it's possible that it's just gravity manipulation. And that makes sense, because when Blast describes his upcoming battle against Garo, he says it'll be a battle for supremacy between two beings who manipulate the reality of the cosmos. Now, Blast knows that Garo has this ability because he knows that he made a deal with God. And after said deal was made, Garo's abilities were described as having the knowledge of the flow of all energy and the behavior of all forces in the universe. And considering what Blast said, I'm thinking that he has a similar ability here, although maybe it's more so towards gravity manipulation, as where Garo seems to be more so energy manipulation. Although in physics, I guess the two can be synonymous at times, if not always. I'm an idiot, so, bear with me. But Blast's theoretical ability to manipulate gravity here lines up with everything we've seen so far. Him opening up wormholes, which also share the aesthetic of black holes, him moving through through dimensions, and his force transfer all kind of lines up with a being who could, in theory, manipulate gravity. But like the true manipulation of gravity, not like the tamed version of it where we, typically see in battle manga where a character can just make things heavier or lighter. And I think that this, like, true gravity manipulation is fitting for a character who could be disaster level god. But going forward into his fight against Garo, he hits him with like multiple of these gravity knuckles and sends him in and out of these portals. It's a pretty amazing sequence. It's like something out of Doctor Strange for sure. Dare I say, he's even surpassing Doctor Strange in this instance, at least the MCU version. Comics are a whole different story. And since we're on that, let me also say that Blast's gravity manipulation here, if it is that, is still pretty tame. Because if he had like true uninhibited control over gravity, then he would be more akin to like a high tier Marvel cosmic being from the comics. And I'm glad that he doesn't, because there would be no stakes and he would essentially just be able to do whatever he wants. And we'd have like another, Beyonder type character on our hands where, it's not really that interesting, at least in the context of the One Punch Man world. We already have one above all in Saitama. We don't really need another character on that level of strength. There needs to be some kind of balance. But anyway, we haven't really seen anyone else fight Cosmic Fear Garo besides Saitama. But when Saitama does land a punch on Garo, he kind of takes it in a similar fashion that he takes from Blast. Now obviously I'm not saying Blast is stronger than Saitama, but it appears that he can deliver a blow similar to like normal restrained Saitama, at least, since, the two are similar. Now Garo is eventually able to copy Blast gravity knuckle ability, and he starts throwing what appears to be like consecutive normal punches at him. Nuclear fission in his left hand, gravity knuckle in his right, and Blast is able to defend against this. He creates an individual portal for each of these fists and redirects them to the sky above them. Pretty incredible sequence here. But if this is in fact like the same consecutive normal punches that we saw him throw against Saitama in the previous chapter, the same that connected with Saitama's fists, then it's possible that we're seeing Blast defend against like a legitimate consecutive normal punch that maybe even a withheld Saitama would have thrown, which I think is also applicable to someone who could be disaster level god. I also mentioned in my Garo video that not even Boros could really deal with consecutive normal punches. And speaking of Boros, that was another thing that we speculated about with Blast. Like, could Blast have taken Boros? Like, for example, if Saitama didn't show up when the aliens arrived in A City, and it ultimately came down to Blast having to save humanity, could he have taken out Boros? And at this point, I'm thinking he probably could have. I mean, it wouldn't have been easy, but I think he probably could have gotten the job done. But yeah, that's pretty much all that we got to see from Blast, and I think it was more than enough, to be honest. He ultimately wound up not even really getting hit by Garo or taking any damage. And this is, like I said, somebody who is pretty much disaster level god, which I guess also means that Blast is certified disaster level god, which I think is justified and needed for the S-Class rank 1 hero. Manju Boros asks, when do you think we'll get to the point of where we see Blast and his friends, and how will we go up to that point after the Neo Heroes arc, or do you think they'll show up in the arc? So your guess is as good as mine as to when Blast will come back in the manga or the webcomic. I didn't expect him to show up in the manga when he did anyway, so he could show up in the next chapter for either continuity. But in my opinion, at least, I think we won't be going into Blast and his space friends for a while, like years, because both continuities have a lot of things to establish before that, so it would make more sense for one to kind of just go into those individual storylines before we open up the big can of worms with Blast and his space friends, because that's like endgame stuff. But let me go into what I think is going on here with Blast and his space friends, because I think it was kind of revealed to us what is going on here in chapter 119 of the webcomic. Now, I've talked about this in another video, and I think I even talked about this on like another channel, but I'm pretty sure all of you watching this video don't know what I'm talking about here or haven't seen my previous videos on this stuff. But anyway, in the cold opening of chapter 119 of the webcomic, where Saitama goes on this quest with like these night dudes, and it's not really supposed to be important on the surface, it's more so supposed to to be comical, if anything, but we know how one is, and he cleverly disguises important pieces of the story with gaggy elements and has them hiding in plain sight. And one of the biggest cases of this ever happening is in this cold opening of chapter 119. So this knight dude is explaining this story to Saitama, and he says, according to legend, a colossal dragon descended upon Earth and became the embodiment of destruction. In just a few days, it took countless lives and scorched large swaths of land. As a result, its overwhelming cruelty became known as the Cruel Dragon. Now, in my opinion, this Cruel Dragon represents the actual origin of God, like the final boss of the series, God. But going further, he says ancient soldiers gathered together and with a great many sacrifices managed to weaken the Cruel Dragon. Seal masters separated the essence of the dragon using 9 seal stones and sealed them in 9 temples scattered across the land. The duty of watching over the Cruel Dragon seals was passed down to our branch known as the Saints. Those who believe themselves to be dragonborn and are plotting to resurrect the Cruel Dragon belong to an organization known as Deathbone. So I'm thinking that this is like the end game and the true story of One Punch Man. God came to Earth back in the day, and then ancient soldiers gathered together, whoever they were, and then the Seal Master separated his essence into 9 seal stones, and I think these seal stones are the cubes that we see, since we know that the cubes are related to God, because if you touch them, you can seemingly communicate with him. Also, when Saitama, Flashy Flash, and Monako observe God, he's kind of in like that fetal position, because I think that's the initial seal that was put on him. He was put inside of like a big hypercube or something, and then that hypercube was divided into individual black cubes that we see in the series, especially the ones that Blast is tracking down. And that brings us to the duty of watching over the Cruel Dragon seals was passed down to our branch known as the Saints. I think that's who these guys are. They're the Saints. Blast is like the saint of Earth, I guess, and then these are the saints of the other planets that God has tried to take over. And then the Deathbone are just the antithesis of the Saints. Psychos, Orochi, Drive Knight, they're kind of like Deathbone members, but not exactly, because obviously they don't identify themselves as that yet. And Saints and Deathbones aren't like the real name of these individual groups. It's just the name that one chose for this cold open. We don't know the true name of their teams yet. Yeah, that's who these guys are, and they're all supposed to protect these cubes so that God doesn't get resurrected. And we see like a silhouette of God in the background here when Blast says, you know, he's not fighting alone out there. Now, I don't know if they're literally fighting against God, because so I assume his presence here is just representing that they are fighting against his forces, probably the Deathbone. So like the other Psychos and Orochis and Drive Knights out there in the galaxy or whatever, that's who they're all fighting against. So considering that this is like the end game stuff, we probably won't find out the truth for like years. Then Sitch asks Zombie Man, he's like, hey, you fought against Homeless Emperor. Is there any important details you want to share about that? And Zombie Man's like, yeah. He said that when he was still a human, he was given divine power by something he called God. So now everybody's aware of the name God. And he's like, yeah, during the fight, I found an opening and I held him down and I was going to make him spill whatever he knew, but suddenly he just started crumbling into solder ashes and dropped dead. And the last thing he said was God. It seemed like he was trying to be shut up. And then Flashy Flash is like, by chance, did you hear anything being said to you telepathically? Because, you know, while we were under the Monster Association, we ran into something and it was trying to grant us power, and it said that if you weren't worthy then you would face forfeiture. So I'm thinking that the thing that we ran into and the thing that killed Homeless Emperor is probably the same God that you just talked about. And of course he's right, because, you know, we saw what had happened. And then Flashy Flash asks Sitch, he's like, hey, you know something about what's going on with Blast, don't you? And this is because, you know, after Flashy Flash, Saitama, and Monako encountered the cube and, you know, talked to God, that's when Blast made his first appearance in the manga. So Flashy Flash is aware of Blast and what he's doing for the most part, because he told them, you know, he's going after the cubes and the thing connected to them. So there's like no hiding anymore for Sitch, because we've known for years that Sitch is tied to Blast in some way and that he knows the truth, but he couldn't talk about it because it's confidential. But now he's just spilling the beans. And he's like, to tell the truth, I've been keeping it hidden until now, but for the past 20 years, Blast has been continuously fighting this God you all encountered. He and his partner and a group of many other collaborators, they were searching for a mysterious cube that could turn humans into monsters. And we see Blast with this human hero looking guy, and those of you who have read the webcomic are like jumping up and down right now, and I get it.
So was I. But obviously I can't talk about it here because it's massive spoilers for the future of the manga. But just know that I'm going to make a video after this in the next couple days talking about who this guy is and why he's so important to the story and how this all connects to him. So if you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe for that if you want to know the truth about everything. I mean, it's heavy spoiler stuff, but it's fascinating. But going further, Sitch is like, it has been handed down over time as some kind of communication device with this god, what some would call a type of O-part or an out-of-place artifact. He had been collecting them and together with his collaborators attempting to analyze them. However, finally 2 years ago, while Blast was battling Elder Centipede, he came into contact with God directly. He refused the transaction of power and pitted himself against God. So that's another huge reveal here. We're finally getting the answer what had happened between Blast and Elder Centipede. This has been going on for like 5 years, you know, since we found out that this was even a thing, because when King was talking to the Peter Worker, he was like, hey, Blast fought Elder Centipede like 2 years ago, but I can't talk about it because it's confidential. And for years, people were like, oh, Blast is a weakling because he couldn't even defeat Elder Centipede because it was said that Elder Centipede was able to escape. And I was like, guys, that's not the full story. We don't know everything. And I'm sure you can find some evidence of me in a video that I've made over the past couple years saying that God is probably involved with that incident. And it turns out that, yeah, of course God is involved with that incident because he probably created Elder Centipede like he created Sage Centipede. But then Sitch is like realizing that it would be safer if only by a small amount if the other heroes and employees were unaware of the existence of God. Blast made it seem like he disappeared without giving so much as a reason in order to protect everyone. So that's the reason why Blast went MIA. He was trying to protect everyone from knowing the existence of God because he felt that if everyone was none the wiser, then they would be less susceptible to being influenced by him, I suppose. And then Sitch is like, the only reason Blast was able to do battle with God is because he's a person with the ability to manipulate space-time. Other heroes have no means of doing such a thing. And we pretty much knew this was the case. I mean, we saw Blast's abilities. But in response, Genos is like, oh, is that so? And he pulls out the core from the future. And then he goes on to explain to them everything that had happened between Saitama and Cosmic Fury Garo in the previous arc, and it takes him like 4 hours. And afterwards, Second Guard and Sitch are like, no, but you claim he flew to Jupiter, destroyed it, then came back? And on top of that, you say he went back in time and changed history? That's a bit out there. And it's like totally understandable that they would react this way. But Zombie Man trying to make sense of this is like, hey, if that's the case, we can confirm by asking Garo, right? Like, what did the police learn from interrogating him? And Second Guard's like, apparently the shock of the final punch made him lose his memory. So not even Garo is apparently aware that Saitama was the one that punched him. And yes, that directly conflicts with what he said to Bang a couple chapters back about, you know, the people that he would like to fight and in order of their strength, which made it seem like he knew that Saitama was the one that defeated him. But I guess this means that he doesn't know. But then Flashy Flash is like, so we don't have any definitive info at all. So this is a good way of having everyone know and not know at the same time that Saitama is the one above all. There's still that air of doubt. Like, they're not completely convinced because they, of course, don't have definitive proof. But then Sitch is like, one thing we can say is that interaction with God's dimension has increased rapidly, Blast said. There might be something in our dimension that's summoning him here. And we see Saitama. So this is another huge reveal. This is confirming that Saitama is the direct reason why everything has been happening since the beginning of the series. Everybody's been saying, you know, for the longest time, like, oh, monster sightings have increased more and more lately. We're seeing demon and dragon level monsters way more commonly than we have before. And it's because of Saitama, because he removed his limiter and God is aware of it. And I know that for the longest time I've been saying that I didn't think that God was aware of Saitama because he removed his limiter. I thought him removing it made him like become outside of God's view, but I was very wrong. I was foolish. Sorry about that. But yeah, God is very aware of Saitama removing his limiter because it's implied that God made the limiter himself because he was afraid that something like this was going to happen. And now that Saitama has removed the limiter, meaning that he is a direct threat to God himself, God is now like upping the ante and making more and more monsters and trying to create more and more powerful beings to be able to stop Saitama, but also simultaneously trying to have him being resurrected back to Earth, you know, trying to fulfill the prophecy, making that Orochi that can be powerful enough to be placed on the altar as well. But then Sitch is like, you know, anyway, Blast will return to us soon with a plan for countermeasures. Until then, our top priorities are unity and solidarity. So this is just putting a pin holder in there, being like, Blast will return, guys, and he's gonna have a plan, but it's probably not gonna be soon. But just know that he's eventually gonna come back. So in One Punch Man chapter 173, we got a whole bunch of crazy reveals. And actually, one of the biggest reveals is something that we're technically not even supposed to know because it hasn't happened yet. Because it's going to happen in the future of the story because it's already kind of happened in the webcomic. But it's not outright said yet. And I'm talking about Blast's partner that we see in the chapter. This cool looking guy with the armor and the two swords. Yeah, this guy's like super important to the overall story, believe it or not. And in order to talk about him and get into the crazy truth and how he connects to so many things, I'm gonna have to go into some serious serious spoilers. So if you don't want to know what's going to happen, you know, don't watch the video. So let's just cut to the chase here. If you've read the webcomic, you probably saw this guy and, you know, you did the Leo meme and you were like, this guy is the Ninja Village leader. And I'm right there with you because I'm pretty sure this is him. Now, before I go further, let me just say it's not confirmed. This is just my opinion and the opinions of many others, I assume, but I think that this guy is the Ninja Village leader for sure. So first, let me explain who the Ninja Village leader is. So in chapter 118 of the webcomic, after Flashy Flash and Sonic defeat the Heavenly Ninja Party, as Gale is dying, he basically explains who the Ninja Village leader is, and he says that he's pretty much like the strongest ninja who ever lived. And according to some rumors, that man's true nature is not human. A comrade once investigated the concealed past of that man. He later disappeared without a trace, but he was able to confirm that he has been alive and continuously conducting assassinations for 300 years. He has different skin colors on different parts of his body as well as multiple heartbeats. In addition, if the target has a strong and healthy body, he will take all of their blood and innards away from the scene. Based on these descriptions, the only thing we can think of is, but he's not able to finish his sentence because Flashy Flash interrupts him. But going further, he just hypes him up more. He's like, yeah, he's so powerful that none of you could hold a candle to him and he would just treat you like a baby. And then we get to see what he looks like, and he looks very similar to Blast's partner that we see in chapter 173. I mean, he has similar hair, he has the two swords coming out of his back, and later on, which we'll talk about, we see like his arsenal and he has like a gun there. Well, we also see that Blast's partner has like a gun too. So I'm pretty sure this is him, but not just because of the aesthetic similarities, but because of course Blast has history with the Ninja Village leader. Because in chapter 115 of the webcomic, when Sonic first meets the Heavenly Ninja Party, they tell him that the founder of the Ninja Village, the one known as the strongest ninja in history, ever since he fought Blast in an epic battle on Lost Consciousness 15 years ago, he's been laying dormant in a recovery capsule. So this kind of ties everything together pretty much, right? Now the 15 years ago thing is important because given the information that we got in chapter 173, it's making more sense now because Sitch said that for the past 20 years, Blast has been continuously fighting this god you all encounter. He, his partner, and a group of many other collaborators, they were searching for a mysterious cube that could turn humans into monsters, and then that's when we see Blast with the Ninja Village leader here. So we don't get the exact time of how long they've been together, but considering that he's saying this directly after the 20 years line, we can assume that they've been together for a while, probably 20 years. Then right after that, we see another flashback of them like observing the cube, and it says it has been handed down over time as a kind of communication device with this god, what some would call a type of opart or out of place artifact. He had been collecting them and together with his collaborators attempting to analyze them. That also kind of makes everything come full circle here because I think last year I made a video about the Ninja Village leader possibly making a deal with God off of the cube. And now that we have all this information, I'm pretty sure it turns out that that's true. Because first of all, the Ninja Village itself looks like a friggin' cube. And I've been talking about this for a while and I was like, guys, it's not a coincidence. And it turns out, yeah, it's not. It all is because of God. So given what we know of in chapter 173, with Blast and the Ninja Village leader here and other collaborators going after the cubes, along with what happens afterwards with Sitch saying that like finally 2 years ago from the present, while Blast was fighting Elder Centipede, he came into contact with God directly. He refused the transaction of power and pitted himself against God. So that means that like one of two things is going on. Either at some point when Blast and the Ninja Village leader were going after the cubes, God encountered the Ninja Village leader just like he did Blast, but instead of the Ninja Village leader declining God, he accepted his exchange of power and he became the monstrous guy that we come to know of him in the webcomic. And then I guess, you know, either 5 years after that or that happened 15 years ago, that's when Blast fought him and, you know, put him into a coma because, you know, he was like, hey, you accepted God's deal. You know, I'm going to have to take you down. Sorry. Or it was even like, hey, I'm going to fight you, Blast. It could have been whatever, but they obviously fought because of the Ninja Village leader accepting God's influence. Now that's one possibility, but the other possibility is that the Ninja Village leader was always God's disciple, at least for 300 years, because it goes back to what Gale was telling Flashy Flash and Sonic in chapter 118. When he's like, when they looked into his past, they found out that he had been continuously conducting assassination for 300 years. Now, either that is going to be retconned in the manga, or they were mistaken, or it is going to be still true in the manga, and maybe, like I said, 300 years ago, that's when he accepted God's deal, and he's kind of just been playing Blast up until this point, going around and collecting the cubes with him, because maybe he was trying to trick Blast into becoming a disciple as well, or just using Blast to gather the cubes, because it seems like gathering the cubes benefits God as well, not just Blast and his boys. Because if we're going off of the lore in, chapter 119 about, the saints and the death bone, there's a good side that wants to collect the cubes and there's a bad side that wants to collect the cubes. Because even in chapter 173, Sitch is like, he, his partner, and a group of many other collaborators were searching for the cubes. So that's probably the saints and, also those spatial beings that we see with Blast as well. So yeah, that ties everything together here. And to go a little more into the Ninja Village and Blast, it turns out that around like 9-ish years ago, because it was when Flashy Flash was 16 years old, Sonic tells Flashy Flash that the night of the day of his incident, where he took out the class, someone else wanted to attack and destroy us. On the day of the graduation and the exam showed up, it was Blast who attacked the Ninja Village. He did not show us orphans any mercy. As they had gone through personality reform to be assassins, the junior trainees naturally tried to battle, but their amateurish ninjutsu were useless against the enemy. As the only strong one, I was able to escape and survive on my own. The rest of the junior trainees got separated. I haven't heard anything from them since. Even if some managed to survive, there wouldn't be much left. So this is another thing that we've been speculating about for years. It's like, we don't know if Blast straight up murdered them or if this was even Blast himself, because we saw that God can impersonate Blast. So it's possible that that was God impersonating Blast, trying to lure them all to become his servants as well. Or it was literally Blast showing up and he was like trying to take them out or making sure that they weren't going to become subservient to God, possibly. I don't know if he was killing them. Maybe he was just, I don't know, trying to arrest them or take them away or something, because it doesn't outright say that he killed them. It says they got separated and I haven't heard anything from them since. So the verdict's still out. But yeah, that's pretty much how everything is connecting here, and it's so satisfying for this to finally come to light. And if you're wondering what happens to the Ninja Village leader, well, after Sonic and Flashy Flash wind up defeating, like I said, the Heavenly Ninja Party, right after Gale explains to them who he is, they wind up going after him and they, plan to take him down together. But when they show up, it turns out that Saitama had already defeated him with like one punch and knocked him into the pavement. And we haven't seen him since then. So either he's dead or he's in another coma, but I think he's going to have a much bigger role in the manga, it seems, or at least more stuff to talk about. I wouldn't be surprised if one still just has Saitama take him out in one punch, but I think at least more will be explained, hopefully.
So believe it or not, there's like even more potential revelations coming out of chapter 173, because we finally got the timeline of Blast's endeavors, or for the most part. There's still a lot of mystery to that, and you've already read the title of this video, but it's like, did Boros come to Earth for Blast instead of Saitama this whole time? And I know you might be thinking, well, we've been talking about that for years now, and yes, it's very true, but it seems like it was actually the truth the whole time. So let me break it down and explain why that's very likely the case. So when Saitama first meets Boros, they have some, chit chat, and Boros introduces himself and whatnot, and he eventually says, want to know what I want? There was a prophecy. Saitama says, a prophecy? Do you mean? Of course, he's referring to Shibawa's prophecy, which is different than the one that Boros is referring to, but he says, no one in the universe was left to face me, so I was bored. But then a seer said, I can enjoy a challenging fight on this planet. That was 20 years ago. It took me time to get here. My subordinates think the prophecy was a lie to make us go away, but it was true. So excite me. It's what I came for. And then, we know the story of what happened after that. But the 20 years ago thing is actually important. It's not just some throwaway time that a lot of us probably thought it was initially. Because in chapter 173, Sitch tells the S-Class that Blast had been fighting against God continuously for the last 20 years. So yeah, I don't think that's a coincidence. I'm pretty sure they're connecting. So now you might be thinking, well, what does Blast fighting against God have to do with Boros? Well, I've also talked about this many times throughout numerous videos, but I think that Boros is connected to God in some way. At the bare minimum, I'm thinking that this alien seer here that he spoke to about, coming to Earth is a product of God. Now, I don't know if God created this guy or if he is subservient to God or whatever, but it's also possible that God took this form to communicate to Boros, because we've seen that he can do that. He was able to take the form of Blast when he was trying to convince Tatsumaki to take his power, and he did the same thing with Garo by becoming Bang. So he usually takes the form of something that you're going to trust in order to give you what you ultimately kind of want, right? And in this case, Boros already had the power, but what he was looking for was a challenge. So God potentially took the form of this alien seer here and gave Boros what he wanted. And then God was like, hey, I know of a really powerful guy, and he's actually on this planet called Earth. And if you go there, you know, he's certainly going to give you a challenge. That also raises the question of like, okay, so why is God even talking to Boros in the first place? Why is God on other planets? Well, it's because I think that God isn't exclusively tied to Earth. Like, he's like a universal being. He's tied to many planets. And one of the main things that I think gives that credence more than ever is because we know that one of Boros's race members is a part of Blast's like galactic team that he has. And in my opinion, I think that Blast's space team here is comprised of members of planets that have all been affected by God in some way, which means that Boros's planet was potentially affected by God. Because we also did see on one of the cover pages that like an astronaut found one of the cubes in space, which I think is trying to tell us that these cubes aren't native to Earth. So it's possible that one of these cubes was on Boros's planet as well, or God was just, you know, interested in Boros's planet. And it's possible that Boros was affected by God in some way, because I think that what we see of Boros is like the equivalent of that race's monsters. Now, at first, he looks just like the member on Blast's team, but I think that when like Boros's armor comes off and he changes into like that blue form, and also, you know, later on in Meteoric Burst, I think that's like the equivalent of him becoming a monster like how humans do. Because Dr. Genus also says when he's explaining everything to Zombie Man that the aliens that invaded a city, you know, Boros and the Dark Matter Thieves, they are also considered monsters. And I don't think that was kind of just an umbrella term and just to be thrown away. I think it was more so one telling us that like, hey, they are monsters just like the monsters that we see on Earth. And the monsters that we see on Earth are all products of God. So I'm thinking that Boros potentially could be a product of God as well, but he's not like fully aware of it, because not everyone is fully aware of God's existence, obviously. Even the ones who have inadvertently accepted his power. So 20 years ago, when Blast discovered the cubes, obviously God was made aware of him and also made aware of what he was trying to do, because Blast was essentially trying to stop the spread of the cubes and trying to stop God's influence. And obviously God doesn't want that. So he looked out into one of the many places that he was involved in, came across Boros and was like, hey, you're looking for a guy to fight? Well, I just ran into this super powerful guy on another planet that I'm inhabiting. Why don't you go there and take him out for me? But this could also be God trying to kill two birds with one stone, because not only could Boros potentially take out Blast, but he could also fulfill the prophecy for God as well, because we saw that under Z City there's that mural that depicts, you know, Orochi eventually coming to be, and that would be a worthy sacrifice that could be placed on the altar and it would resurrect God to the earth. And what I took away from that is that it doesn't literally like have to be Orochi that goes on the altar. It just needs to be someone as powerful as Orochi, essentially. I mean, yes, it literally depicts Orochi, but I think that more so is just saying that there eventually, in theory, will be a monster born that will look like Orochi. I mean, I could be wrong about that, but I just think that it just needs to be as strong as Orochi, if any. Like, he needs that a certain amount of power to, like, resurrect God. So, like I said, two birds with one stone. Boros takes out Blast and then gets tricked to go onto the altar. And then, you know, God is resurrected that way. And, you know, hypothetically, we can just talk about, like, what would have happened if Boros did show up and he did face Blast. Like, let's just say he showed up sooner than he did and he did run into Saitama. Well, I guess Blast would have beat him, right? I mean, like last year it was definitely up for debate, but now that we've seen what happened with Cosmic Fear Garo and how Blast was able to fare against him, we could assume that Blast would probably defeat Boros because of that, right? Because obviously Cosmic Fear Garo pushed Saitama way further than even Meteoric Burst Boros did, like way further. And Blast was pretty impressive against him, so I assume that Blast could defeat Boros. I mean, it probably wouldn't be easy, but he would eventually get the job done for sure, right?
Do you think Blast is future Garo? So this is a super thanks from someone whose name I don't know how to say. I don't even think I can begin to even try to say it, but it looks Russian, so thank you, comrade, for the super thanks. So I checked out this short that you have linked, and I agree with at least what he was saying about God probably being behind the alien seer that Boros saw. But then the end of that brought in the question of, is Blast Garo from the future, because they both have the same scars. So this is something that's been talked about the last couple months, actually, ever since the whole time travel stuff was introduced into the series. So let me give my thoughts on this. So like when you first hear this, you think like, wait, Blast, Garo from the future, that kind of sounds exciting and cool. Wait, does that work? And then you see that they both have the same, you know, scar across their face. It's like, that's interesting. Why do they both have that? And then later on, you know, we find out that Garo eventually becomes the avatar of God, gains all of these cosmic abilities and whatnot, and then is eventually killed by God for teaching Saitama how to go back in time using those cosmic abilities. So it makes you wonder, like, did that Garo survive and then he became Blast somehow? Because I guess that would explain Blast having, you know, his cosmic abilities, or his abilities to manipulate space-time, as Sitch said. And that is one theory, but to be honest, I just don't think Blast is Garo or Garo is Blast. Yes, they both have the same scar, and it's very interesting, but I think it's more so just a repeated design, possibly, because we saw that just 2 years ago, Blast didn't have that scar across his face. And also just considering that they're existing in the same time, and Blast has no recollection of Saitama, which he would if he was Garo. So I just don't think Blast is Garo. I would more so prefer it if they're just their own separate characters, but I'll just say that the scar across the face is compelling, but it's just a coincidence, I suppose.
All right, so we're going to be continuing my Truth About One Punch Man series, and today we're going to be talking about Blast, the #1 S-Class hero. I'm also going to be talking about a lot of stuff that I already went over in my previous videos in this series, so please check out the playlist that I have in case you need to be caught up on all of this stuff or you just need a refresher. But aside from us knowing that Blast is the #1 S-Class hero, we also know that he's really interested in the cubes that are connected to God. So far in the series, we've seen both past and present. He's gone around collecting these cubes, and on the surface, his motives have stayed pretty ambiguous. But if you've been following these videos, you'll know that we pretty much know what's going on with them. So let me get into the Egyptian mythological figure that Blast is based off of, and that is Ptah. So Ptah is an ancient Egyptian deity, a creator god, and patron of craftsmen and architects. In the Triad of Memphis, he is the husband of Sekhmet and the father of Nefertim. He is also regarded as the father of the sage Imhotep. So let's break down those three names there. So Sekhmet represents Fubuki, Nefertim represents blue, and I'm pretty sure Imhotep represents Sitch. Now, as for Sekhmet being Fubuki, I'm going to be talking about that in another video dedicated to her. But obviously, Blast isn't the husband of Fubuki in One Punch Man, but I think this more so represents that they are related. And I'm sure many of us have speculated that it's likely that Blast is related to Tatsumaki and Fubuki in some way. But going off of this and the history of the One Punch Man world that is presented to us, it seems that he is their father. So what really makes me think that is that their ages kind of line up. Blast's implied age is to be like, I don't know, in his 50s or something. So that would make sense that he'd be the father of a 28 and 23-year-old. And then of course also they're all Espers, or at least Blast is implied to be an Esper, or it's said by Miss F, who is Fubuki, in the One Punch Man encyclopedia that Blast is straight up an Esper. And also when Blast saves Tatsumaki from that testing facility, he somehow knows that she has a sister. Now either Blast is like reading Tatsumaki's mind by putting his hand on her head, or he simply always knew because they're his daughters. And also we never know who the true parents of Tatsumaki and Fubuki are. We just know right off the bat that they were given to a foster family, and then their foster family sold them off to the cube testing facility. So it just makes sense to me that Blast is their father, and he put them up for adoption because, you know, he's Blast and he has to do the cube stuff, which we'll get into. And while we don't know Blast's official color scheme yet, I'm pretty sure his hair is going to be revealed to be blue because Ptah's head is blue, and that could explain why Tatsumaki's hair is green and why Fubuki's hair is like black and green or whatever it is. Maybe their mother had blonde hair or something. So as for Nefertim, this is blue. So the little information that we have on him says that Nefertim was eventually seen as the son of the creator god Ptah, and the goddesses Sekhmet and Bast, who are Fubuki and Tatsumaki, were sometimes called his mother. In art, Nefertim is usually depicted as a beautiful young man having blue water lily flowers around his head. And as for Imhotep, like I said, I'm pretty sure this is Sitch. So it says Imhotep was an Egyptian counselor to Pharaoh Djoser. I'm pretty sure Djoser is Agoni and possible architect of Djoser's step pyramid and the high priest of the sun god Ra at Heliopolis. So we all know that Ra is Saitama by now, and Heliopolis is the Hero Association. And the main reasoning for Imhotep being Sitch, because he is the one directly in the Hero Association who talks about Blast and is name dropped by Blast. Because when Blast is leaving with Saitama and Flashy Flash, he says, hey, say hi to Sitch and Tatsumaki for me. And of course, him being a high priest to Ra at Heliopolis, which is the Hero Association as we established, and this means the City of the Sun. Sun, Ra, Saitama, and it was principally noted as the cult center of the sun god Atum, who is king, who came to be identified with Ra, and this is why Saitama lives at the Hero Association currently, because it's this. But anyway, let's go back to Ta, because he is generally represented in the guise of a man with green skin, contained in a shroud sticking to the skin, wearing a divine beard and holding a scepter containing 3 powerful symbols of the ancient Egyptian religion: power, life, and stability. His form is found contained in its white shroud, wearing the Atef crown, an attribute of Osiris, who we've established is God. Gradually, he formed with Osiris a new deity called Ta Sokar Osiris. So this means a few things in my opinion. First of all, of course, we've seen that God takes the form of Blast, and when he's like exposed, he looks like a fusion of God and Blast. But also, I'm pretty sure this means that the black hole singularity abilities that we see coming from Blast are also coming from God. Now, we don't know how he did this yet, but in my opinion, he somehow reverse engineered the cube, or just the abilities that God can give to you. Because also, God knows Blast's name. When we first see Saitama and Flashy Flash make contact with God after Blast shows up, God's like, is that Blast? So they definitely have a history. So I don't know if Blast like made a deal with God originally, and then he somehow tricked him and then retained the powers, but didn't have to become reliant on him or have that linked as to where he can receive confiscation, or Blast using his inherent Esper power somehow reverse engineered the cube that way and then siphoned its power and made himself stronger. Now, another thing about Ta is that he's an Egyptian creator god who conceived the world and brought it into being through the creative power of speech. The hymn of Ta says that Ta created the world in the design of his heart, and that he gave life to all the gods through his heart and his tongue. So all the other gods are the heroes, of course, and I think this means that since we know that Blast is like the first shown person to be a hero in the series, because when we first see him in the flashback, he says like, you know, I'm a hero, although that's more of a hobby, I do have a proper job. And I think that when the Hero Association came together after it was formed by Agoni, witnessing the events of Saitama aka Ra, I guess Sitch came on board at first as well, but Sitch knew Blast or something. I don't know. We're just gonna have to really speculate a lot about this because there's little information to go off of in the story and also the Egyptian literature. But I assume that the way that the Hero Association works and the formation of the heroes and all that stuff is large in part because of Blast's input. And this also goes into the cult of Ta. Now, I think this means multiple things because the cult of Ta could either just be the Hero Association itself, but it could also be this League of Blast that we see in space or wherever they are after Blast reveals that he's not fighting alone out there. And this was also secretly revealed to us by One in chapter 119 of the webcomic. I talked about this in my previous video, but it basically says that after the cruel dragon came to Earth, aka Osiris, God, ancient soldiers gathered together and with a great many sacrifices managed to weaken the cruel dragon. Seal Masters separated the essence of the dragon using the 9 seal stones and sealed them in the temples scattered across the land. So this of course parallels the original Osiris myth, which One is choosing to use the version that says that Osiris's brother Set conspired with many accomplices and tricked Osiris to get into a box, which he cut up into pieces and threw into the Nile. And this is basically what's happening in the One Punch Man continuity. That's why we see God in that fetal position, because that was like the hypercube or whatever he was put inside of by these seal masters, and then it was cut into pieces, and that's why there's multiple cubes
cubes out there. But going further, it says the duty of watching over the cruel dragon seal was passed down to our branch known as Saints. These Saints, like I talked about before, I'm pretty sure are Blast and his Green Lantern Corps that we see. And this is of course the reason why he is always going after the cubes. And just to finish this off, let me just put it out there that Blast is a good guy. I mean, if we already haven't established that enough by now. But going back into the Egyptian stuff, it says that Ta could correspond with the sun deities Ra and Atem during the Armana period, where he embodied the divine essence of which the sun god was fed to come into existence. So yeah, Ra is Saitama, Blast is not a bad guy. But yeah, that's all of the insight that we're really going to be able to get into Blast at this point, because Ta himself is kind of ambiguous, just the way that Blast is. We know more than we did originally, I guess, but we're just going to have to wait because one has carefully crafted this character to stay mysterious. Boros asks, do you think time travel is going to come back into the series, and if it's problematic? Do you think Blast and his group will notice what happened and might encounter Saitama when Blast was going to teleport to where he was going originally to face Garo? But now that everyone saw Saitama punch Garo, do you think everybody's going to see Saitama as a bigger threat and Blast might try to apprehend him instead of trying to recruit him into his group? So we got quite a bit to unpack here. So in chapter 168, long story short, we saw at the end of Garo versus Saitama, Garo seeing the error in his ways after inadvertently killing everyone, including Tario, with his cosmic radiation, that in order to fix that, he basically wants to send Saitama back in time to make sure that it would never happen in the first place. And since Garo had become the avatar of God, and with that receiving the knowledge of all energy and forces in the universe, he was able to figure out how to time travel. And apparently he could do this by manipulating subatomic particles. So he teaches this to Saitama very quickly, because if anyone is going to learn this, it is Saitama after all, and it's even stated by Garo in this chapter that he could do it without the assistance of God, for sure, because he's so freaking powerful. But of course, this is a taboo use of God's power, so God straight up kills Garo in this chapter as well. But anyway, Saitama successfully goes back in time, and right before he reaches the moment at the end of chapter 164, he throws a punch, and as he comes into that new timeline, he completely takes out Garo, therefore stopping him before he's able to release his cosmic radiation. However, afterwards, we see that there are now two Saitamas in this reality. There's the Saitama of the past from the original chapter 165, and then we see the Saitama that we've been following in the future, I guess you could say now, from 165 to 168, the naked, buffed up Saitama. And I guess some kind of quantum entanglement happens or something, and the two Saitamas fuse together into one being. And afterwards, it appears that Saitama has forgotten everything that has transpired after chapter 165, because he says the last thing he remembers is getting hit by Garo's gamma ray burst. He's also surprised that he's even holding Genos' core, something that he's been holding the whole time, after Garo had ripped it out of Genos. But that's pretty interesting, right? That the core doesn't fuse with Genos' existing core in this past timeline that they're currently in. So I guess this only applies to like living things or organic things maybe. But I also think that this core is important for multiple reasons, because on the surface it seems like it's probably going to be the catalyst for some kind of power up with Genos, him having two cores now or something like that. But I wouldn't be surprised if this at least recorded data up until it was ripped out of Genos, meaning that it could be aware of what happened at least up until that point, which is something that technically Saitama right now shouldn't be aware of. And that is at least Blast showing up, which goes into the other part of your question here. So now that we're in this new past timeline, the last time that we had seen Blast and his crew was when like the gargoyle Garo sent Saitama like into that mountain, and it caused like a reverberation through Earth, and we see Blast saying the Earth's magnetic and gravitational fields are going crazy, a spatial distortion is creating a hole in the dimensional seal, he's gonna break through, referring to God, we've got to hurry and repair it. And then after that point, Blast shows up in chapter 166 only after Garo had released a whole bunch of his cosmic radiation. It's possible that Blast might not even show up now, but I do think that he probably will. And as for everyone
witnessing Saitama defeating Garo, I'm not entirely sure if they did or if they didn't. I mean, before chapter 165, it's portrayed as the majority of the onlookers not really knowing what's going on. And I don't know if that's necessarily going to change here, because when Saitama did punch Garo, he was naked. And now that he has clothes on, I'm sure that's going to, I don't know, do the whole Clark Kent Superman thing with glasses on and off. Not really sure, because going forward, we need to keep continuing the story of not everyone being aware of Saitama yet. So I think that's going to be the out here for the most part. I mean, there's going to be more characters aware of him, of course. I mean, as we've just seen throughout this arc in general, but coming out of it, I think it's going to play out the same way it did for the most part in the webcomic, as to where Saitama is going to get some credit for this and will be promoted to a rank 13 or something, but other than that, I don't think it's going to go much further. Now, going back to Blast possibly showing up, I do think that's possible, and he might realize that there's something funky going on with Saitama. And if not even just Saitama, he might realize that there's something going on with the core. Blast has some kind of awareness of this stuff, I'm sure. And I don't know if he's necessarily going to see Saitama as a threat, because Blast is obviously aware of God and all of that stuff. And he's going to know that Saitama really has nothing to do with God. So I don't see why he would really be apprehensive of him or see him as a threat or anything. But what I personally would like is that if Blast does figure out what's going on or does realize that Saitama is the one who stopped Garo, then at least he gives some serious exposition to Saitama and the audience as well about God and what's going on with his team possibly. I mean, maybe it's a little too soon for him to spill all of the beans, but at least just give us a little bit, sending us into, you know, the next arc afterward. Little Ferrari asks, do you think Blast will be evolved at all in the Neo Heroes arc for the manga, since we saw a good amount of him in the Monster Association arc? I only ask since Blue gets introduced in that arc for the webcomic. I don't see how they would, since Blast is mainly tied to God, but we didn't think we would get him that much in this arc, so anything can happen. Indeed, anything can happen at this point in the manga's continuity, and it's very possible that Blast will show up in the next arc, and I say next arc loosely because Blue and the Neo Heroes being the focal point of the story isn't necessarily going to be like directly the next arc, but it's definitely going to be the next big long arc that happens in the manga, if of course it does continue to follow the blueprint that the webcomic has established at this point. Before I go any further, let me just explain who Blue is in case you're unaware or you just need like a refresher. So long story short, after the Monster Association arc and all the stuff with Garo wraps up, it's revealed that a rival to the Hero Association is made, and this is called the Neo Heroes. They're pretty much doing the same thing as the Hero Association, but in a more structured and progressive way. This organization also has like their own version of the S-Class, which they call the Neo Leaders, and the leader of the Neo Leaders is this teenager by the name of Blue, and when we first see Blue, he's revealed to be the son of Blast. Now currently, as of this recording, it hasn't really been fully confirmed that he is in fact the son of Blast, because believe it or not, we haven't seen Blast real time in the webcomic yet. Right, he actually shows up in the manga before he did in the webcomic. In that continuity, we still have only seen him in flashback. But in my opinion, at least, I think Blue is the legitimate son of Blast. Not gonna bore you with the Egyptian mythology stuff that they're based off of, but that kind of confirms it, if not for the fact that they both have like the same type of eyes. And I know that it's revealed that Blue is wearing contacts, but I don't think those contacts are necessarily giving him the aesthetic of Blast's eyes. I think that's more so going to go into the corrupt organization storyline that's going to be revealed if the webcomic continuity ever returns. Aside from just the eye similarity, Blue does seem to have some kind of energy manipulation abilities, and even that in itself is kind of polarizing in the webcomic community, I guess you could say, because he is wearing a suit after all. And one of the aspects of the Neo Heroes is that they're all given these power suits, and I won't go into my conspiratorial take on them because I've already talked about it ad nauseum in plenty of videos. Some people seem to think that all of Blue's abilities come from this suit, and I just don't think that's the case, because if that was, then why aren't the other Neo Heroes given suits that are this powerful and have these type of abilities to them? Now, I do think that Blue certainly uses this suit as a conduit for his abilities, but I don't think they exclusively come from the suit itself. Now, like I said, Blue seems to have some kind of energy manipulation ability, and as we've seen from Blast, he kind of has the same thing, which means that Blue very likely hereditarily received some kind of ability from Blast. And so far from our time with Blue, it seems like he may have not even met Blast yet, and if he did, he met him when he was like a small child or something. It's really up in the air at this point, but considering that we now know what Blast has been up to, you know, protecting the world from God essentially and trying to keep the cubes intact, as well as the dimensional seal that is allegedly holding God back from entering into our reality, that's the reason why he hasn't been in Blue's life. But that being said, I do think they will of course ultimately meet, and I think it might have to do with Saitama, because right now in the webcomic there seems to be this inevitable confrontation between Blue and Saitama. Blue is pretty much the only person besides Genos that saw Saitama saving a My Mask after it was revealed to the world that he was actually a monster. And given that Blue is like, you know, all about justice and doing the right thing, he saw Saitama as basically aiding and abetting a My Mask, who is essentially like the world's most wanted man at this point, because he's been like a super powerful monster hiding in plain sight this whole time. So I wouldn't be surprised that when Blue ultimately tries to fight Saitama, or something along the lines of that happens, that's when we see Blast show up. Now, if that happens in the webcomic, Blast's introduction is going to be way different because he has a lot of explaining to do at that point, but in the manga it'll be more cohesive because we've already been established to what's going on with Blast. More so, we'll just have to find out who Blue's mother is, and if Blue is somehow related to Tatsumaki and Fubuki, because I do think that there's something going on there. I don't know necessarily if Blast is like Tatsumaki and Fubuki's father, but he might be like their uncle or something like that. John H asks, do you think it's possible that Blast and Saitama fight at this point? I really don't see it unless they make heavy changes to Blue's character and that causes them to fight in some way, but who really knows? So I feel like I'm partly responsible for hyping up this alleged fight over the years, and it's not like I was intentionally trying to mislead everyone into thinking something was going to happen when it really wasn't. I was just, you know, following the story, given the information that we had at the time, and it made sense to me. But then again, I don't really make sense in the first place, so it's kind of a paradox. But more of you veteran fans of One Punch Man know that we didn't really know much about Blast until like the last year or so. And with that being said, there was a lot of assumptions made of him, and I know I did my fair share and I continue to do so. But now that I know way more than I did before, not only what we know on the surface about Blast, but more so now that I have a better understanding of the series, you know, with the whole Myth of Osiris thing, please check out my video I dropped earlier this week about the truth about Saitama. But like I said in that video, Saitama isn't the only character who is based off of existing lore. The other S-Class heroes, including Blast, are based off of existing lore as well. Like I also said in that video, I'm going to be making multiple videos pertaining to the S-Class heroes and other characters, including Blast, because I know who he is based off of, and also even who Blue is based off of as well. And since I now have that information, I can say that Blast is pretty much a good guy, like through and through. Thought before there was going to be a chance maybe he was like an anti-hero, maybe an anti-villain, or he was going to have some kind of misunderstanding with Saitama that led to them fighting, but it just doesn't seem likely now. I mean, of course, one could change it and they could have a misunderstanding and they fight, but like I said, given the existing lore, it just doesn't seem likely, and there really wouldn't be a good reason for Blast to fight really anyone outside of like handling God and his disciples, because that's really what Blast's whole thing is right now. Blast is more so on like the universal or galactic scale of things, as where the domestic affairs of Earth aren't really too high on his list of priorities, especially now that the S-Class are a thing. And also, if they did fight, I mean, Saitama would just, you know, defeat him very easily. Saitama is stronger than what I even initially gave him credit for, but I don't want to completely deflate everyone's expectations here. I mean, I'm pretty sure we're going to see Blast fight and like go all out at some point, likely either against God or his strongest disciples, because there's going to be a portion in the story where Saitama is like benched, and it's going to seem pretty helpless for like the humans and the heroes and everything. And I guess that's where Blast will come into play and be his most prominent, I suppose. Now, the lore also doesn't dictate that Blast is going to die like I assumed that he would, but I also think there's a chance that he still could.
good because he's kind of like the perfect candidate for death. I've talked about this in many videos about characters like Blast wind up dying in mangas and animes. But yeah, I would just say it's unlikely that they're going to fight, but you know, there's like a small chance maybe.
Boros asks, hey Z, I want to know your thoughts on why God appeared in front of Blast while he was fighting Elder Centipede. So this is a great question, and I've been asked this a lot over the last couple of days, because given the timeline that we got, it's like, why did God suddenly appear 2 years ago? Because it was also said in chapter 173 that Blast had been fighting God for like 20 years. So the way that I take this is that Blast and his boys discovered the cubes like 20 years ago at least. I guess that's when it all started. And they knew that God existed because of them, because you know, if you touch them, you can communicate with him and he tries to make a deal with you. So that's how he knew that God existed for sure, and that he was technically fighting against him. And the whole fighting, I guess, means that he was fighting people that had made deals with the cubes or other monsters that were directly tied to God, because, you know, like I talked about in my previous video, that it's very likely that the ninja leader, who was Blast's partner apparently, made a deal with God, and, you know, he at least fought against him. So I assume that he fought against others as well. But like I said, monsters too. But it was only until 2 years ago that Blast had actually seen God for the first time. And it's interesting that when he sees him in this similar form that Psychos saw him. Now, Psychos was able to see God after she started to merge with Orochi. And this was after it's implied that God like brought Orochi back to life or something. We don't see it, kind of happens off panel. But after Saitama defeated Orochi and he was like climbing up to the altar, he suddenly came back in that goopy form, and then, you know, like I said, fused with Psychos, and then she was able to see God. He didn't talk to her or anything. She kind of just received his power. So Blast seeing God in a similar way is maybe because he made contact with Elder Centipede possibly. And that goes into like, why was Elder Centipede even there in the first place? Well, first of all, I assume that Elder Centipede is a product of God, the same way that we saw that Sage Centipede was a product of him. And why Elder Centipede suddenly showed up 2 years ago, I think it might have something to do with Saitama maybe, because now we know that God is definitely aware of Saitama, and I'll go more into that. But the 2 years ago thing I think is important, because when Saitama is explaining to Dr. Genus like how he removed his limiter without directly saying it, he says, you know, I was able to get this strong in 3 years, because, you know, that's when he initially fought Crablante and he started training after that. And then he tells him, you know, the training and everything, and then he says, but 1 year later I noticed a change. I was bald and I'd gotten stronger. So it's that point that he removed his limiter. So if he's saying that this is 1 year after he had started training, you know, 3 years ago, then that means that that was 2 years ago from the current time in the story, which could possibly line up with when Elder Centipede appeared along with Blast seeing God. And that's maybe why God made Elder Centipede, because he realized that Saitama had removed his limiter. Because it also goes back to what Sage Centipede said after he was made. He emerged to destroy the indomitable fist that is turned against God. And that's a more straightforward narrative for sure, but in the Viz it's a little different. It says, we, referring to him and Evil Natural Ocean, have come to destroy your hateful fists that wrong the gods. I am an incarnation of Father Earth. But regardless, I think it's getting across the same point, because later on Garo says that, you know, I thought he was talking about me, you know, the hateful fist or the indomitable fist. He realized he was actually talking about Saitama, and in fact he was. So like I said, if Sage Centipede came from God, Elder Centipede very likely came from him as well, and he was sent to take out Saitama maybe. But we don't know the exact location that Elder Centipede appeared 2 years ago, as far as I know. Because I think when he appears in the manga, when he like fights against Metal Bat, I think that's like S City, right? So if it's revealed to be Z City, then yeah, for sure it probably is the reason why. But also in chapter 173, Sitch tells Blast that interaction with God's dimension has increased rapidly. There might be something in our dimension that's summoning him here, and we see Saitama. So yeah, I think it's like Saitama removing his limiter caused God to go into like panic mode, and that's when like he appeared in front of Blast. Because I guess aside from making Elder Centipede, he wanted to make Blast his avatar because he felt that he would be strong enough to take down Saitama. Because, you know, God doesn't want anyone to remove their limiter, because then they become a direct threat to him. I talk about this in my Egyptian mythology videos, so I won't bore you with all that stuff here, but you can always check out the playlist on my channel. It's called The Truth About One Punch Man. But yeah, this is all kind of coming together in a very fun way, and I'm really looking forward to seeing if it's true or not. Little Ferrari asks, do you think Elder Centipede was stronger when he fought Blast 2 years ago? It shows Blast bloody afterwards. Or was God contacting Blast somehow damage him? I think Blast would have no problem defeating Elder Centipede based on what we've seen of him so far. So I agree, and it is weird the timing of it, like panel-wise, because he is damaged before God interacts with him, or at least it's shown, or that could be a mistake. I don't know, but maybe Blast wasn't as strong as he was now 2 years ago. I'm not really sure. Maybe Elder Centipede was like being amplified by God at that time, possibly. It just doesn't really make sense because Blast should just be able to make quick work of Elder Centipede, if anything, because Blast's feats are like definitely impressive enough to be able to defeat the Elder Centipede that we've seen. So I think there had to be some kind of God trickery, because Elder Centipede technically shouldn't have been stronger before, because when he emerges and goes against Metal Bat, they say that he was bigger than he was 2 years ago. So not really sure what to make of this. I mean, I don't really think it's a big deal. We know that Blast would easily destroy Elder Centipede, so it probably had something to do with what God was doing.